order. The regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Today is June 21st, and it is 6 p.m. by the clock on the wall. Mr. Harmon, would you take the roll, please?
Chairman Pranzo.
Present.
Commissioner Schopel.
Present.
Commissioner Schmidt. Commissioner Frost.
Present.
Council Liaison Hawkins is here. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. Would you all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, discussion, approval, disapproval of the minutes of the regular meeting conducted on June 7th, 2018. I'll open it up to the commission. Do we have any comments?
I have none, Mr. Commissioner.
Then I'll make a motion that we approve the regular meeting minutes conducted on June 7th, 2018. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion by Chairman Pranzo, second by Vice Chairman Frost. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carried. New business. Okay. This is going to take some work. We actually should have set up tables on the floor for this so that we were closer together. So we'll just have to work through this. This is quite a document that has been presented to us. And I don't know that we'll get through it all the way. But anyway, this is a work session presentation and discussion on the town proposed draft text amendments to develop code part 7, parking, loading, and unloading. Mr. Harmon, do we have a presentation?
We do, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. I need to stop you for just a moment. We'll move to, recess from, I'm losing words. This senior stuff is the, yes, thank you. Said well over there. And move into a work session. Do I have a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
We're in work session. Okay, now we can
Go at it.
Where would you like to start, sir?
Well, first of all, I'd like to actually kind of echo what you said about getting all together, but we were going to do that at a future meeting. Tonight is really to introduce the topic and go through some basic information related to this particular section of the code, because it will lend itself to all of the updates that will be coming before the commission as we move forward with them. So tonight isn't necessarily, we won't necessarily get into the meat of this particular section, other than just kind of give you the basic overview. If you have general questions, we'll handle those. The next step after this, I'll go into in more detail when we get to the end of the presentation. I also included a copy of the PowerPoint in your packet, so you'll have it to make notes from in the future or tonight, whichever you prefer. As you recall, we had a presentation a few meetings back regarding the code amendments in general and some of the needs. This is one that was given priority for several reasons. One, we wanted to better define terms and requirements for parking lots and parking quantities for various types of uses. Also, we are working with the town clerk's office on reformatting the entire development code to hopefully simplify it. If you look through it now, for example, there's no place to put a new code, a new section. Mm-hmm. The way the numbering system is on there, although it's kind of comprehensive, there's only a couple places where there's gaps in numbers. Should we have to add any additional sections to the code, there was generally no place to put them. So we're going to be modifying the numbering system as we go along. We'll show you an example shortly. And then also addressing future technology as it relates to vehicles. Current issues that we've noted of late, limited parking requirements. We haven't noted, there is no allowances for electric vehicle parking or charging stations. The overall numbering system of the code itself, and just some general ambiguous language that'll be identified as we go on. Not all of these, the ambiguous language necessarily relates just to parking. This is throughout the code, and it'll be things we address as we move forward. First of all, just the layout and numbering system of the code itself. For example, parking is labeled as Part 7. We have no idea where that came from. Apparently, some years ago, when the code, all of the town code was sent out for recodification, whatever company was hired kind of created their own system. And it's my conversation with the town clerk. She's not happy with it, and we definitely aren't for the development code. The other sections, I've noticed similar issues, not quite as severe as the development code because it is so comprehensive, so many pages, so many subsections, et cetera. So we are looking at an entirely new numbering system. It'll still be 150, will be the development code, but the subsets as we go through it will be modified as we go along. We're going to go back to a more general outline type format of Roman numerals and additional lettering and numbering. An example of that, right now the parking code portion is called part, I forget the number, 7 something. So rather than the parking standards or definitions and purpose and all those things having 157, 158, 159, 160, it'll just have 156 will be parking. So if somebody wants to address the parking code, it'll be section 156 of the development code. And then each subsection will be Roman numeraled and then subsetted down to alphabetical and regular numbering systems. So, and the next level down would be lowercase alphabet, things of that nature. So it's just a little easier to follow, more, a little bit more indentation as it moves forward, so you can see the hierarchy of the code, and you'll start seeing that with the development code in the parking section first. A little bit later in tonight's presentation will be the small cell. It has the old numbering system, so you'll be able to see a little bit of comparison. We will be adjusting that prior to public hearing and have that set up in this similar type format. Just a few of the terms that we're looking at adding. We're going to address the whole electric vehicle thing. We have a lot of other communities to draw from on this, so we're not going to be reinventing the wheel. Also, there's little things about recreational vehicle storage in required spaces, things that we do run across occasionally. We want to make sure it's covered. The other thing we noticed throughout the code, it refers to the community development director, it refers to the planning director, it refers to different people. And so rather than changing it every time there's some kind of restructuring, the term zoning administrator is used statutorily, and therefore we're going to address that in our code so that what happens, a zoning administrator is typically appointed by the town manager in the case here, or the city manager in other communities. And so that will be the constant throughout the code as we move forward. We'll be adjusting it accordingly.
Let me stop you there.
Pardon me?
Let me stop you there.
Certainly.
Zoning administrator feels like an ad hoc title. We've got other ad hoc titles, and I'm wondering why we can't stay inside traditional titles.
Well, this one actually is a traditional title. Zoning administrator you'll find in numerous communities just in Arizona alone, but you'll find it nationally.
Well, where does the planning and zoning director fit into this model?
He can be the zoning administrator, or you can hire an outside one. It adds a little bit of flexibility. Certain communities, for example, like Glendale, Phoenix, a few others actually they hire a zoning administrator strictly for the purposes as outlined in their codes. They handle variances in some places rather than a board of adjustment. They handle certain appeals, things of that nature. In a lot of codes, the zoning administrator is a generic title that's used for the person who will write opinions.
Here's where I'm going with all of this.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to the question, so I am going to refer this to staff.
Okay.
Under the Arizona Revised Statutes, there are definitions of certain titles. Planning and Zoning Director, for instance, I believe is assigned as an agent, which means that he's has a fiduciary responsibility to do no harm. Now, I don't know about zoning administrator, where he sits in the Arizona Revised Statutes. So I want to stay, you're telling me this is a traditional title, but it still sounds like, based on what you've said, it's a title they stick on somebody to administrate zoning. But
We'd be happy to bring back clarification on it.
I would appreciate that very much, because we've got a development services director. Where the hell did that come from? Now we got a zoning administrator, which is new to me,
Okay.
but probably not new to the rest of the world, okay?
Yeah, we'd be happy to bring that back.
Yeah, I want to get these things in an envelope where there's actual duties assigned by law, and be able to hold those people responsible for what they do.
Be happy to do that, Mr. Chairman. We'll put that together for you as a subset to this discussion.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Certainly. The next area I want to just touch on, we've looked over, and none of this is cast in stone. You have a markup copy that has strikeouts, has red line, for new verbiage, and all of it is going to be what we will discuss as this moves forward. So where we're starting, though, are providing you with examples or ideas or suggestions. They can be struck, we can be added to, we can change formulas, and things like that. So we're not married to anything that's in there. It's really a starting point. But we're looking to add more parking as needed. One of the requirements is to add more parking if a use changes. We do address that right now in the code, but it's not overly definitive on how it should be handled. And that is if a more intensive use goes into usually a commercial business, going from, let's say, a bookstore to a restaurant, where you have much more intensive use, where additional parking would be typically required if there was a build from the ground up. So we want to address that. All parking to be paved, that's been an obvious recent discussion point, commission and council level. And we've got more detail on that addressed. And we're calling it all parking, required or elected. In other words, the required parking will be based on the formulas that will be in the code. But if you wish to add more parking, then you're going to pave it. It's not a matter you can just blade out some area of dirt and park more cars on it because you feel your use needs that or that you want to do that. If you're going to park on a surface, it's going to be a paved per town standards.
We're going to find a way to delineate between existing business. Let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
We now have 18 dark buildings on Main Street.
Right.
Is there a period of time, I don't want this thing to be used as a hammer where somebody comes in, wants to buy the building, open up a business, and all of a sudden they've got to be responsible for parking on an existing building. That's not going to work.
Agreed. And especially in the downtown area. Downtown area is going to be treated somewhat differently as it is now. It's currently treated differently because the downtown does have on-street parking. It has public parking areas. And this will be finalized when we get into the final stages in such a way that the downtown adaptive reuse, if you want to call it, of some of the existing buildings will not be required necessarily to add additional parking. We want to get those buildings filled up.
I just don't want us to get painted into a corner.
No.
All right.
That is not the intent by any stretch. Also,
Commissioner Frost?
oh, I'm sorry.
Ask a quick question while we're there. What do you envision with the using of the term paved?
Well, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay. Good.
When I say we'll get to that, in the strikeout draft text we gave you, we've done some modification to the current paving requirements as far as the types of surfaces, and each one will be taken basically case by case as to which is acceptable depending on location and use and whatever. But basically, it's concrete, bituminous concrete, stabilized granite surfaces, materials. There's a number of different materials that are out there beyond just asphalt and concrete that have provided adequate paved, dust-proof structural parking. And so we've expanded the allowances in there on how those would be, could be looked at or proposed, but they still would have to be acceptable to the town engineer and the fire department, of course, because it has to hold a certain axle weight of vehicle
Right.
on it.
So would this apply to John Q. homeowner who's parking an RV on the side of their home currently on decomposed granite?
That's RV storage. That's not really.
Or a car or a...
That's not considered day-to-day parking where vehicles are coming and going and there's a constant pressure and usage of the surface itself. However, doesn't mean we can't discuss that as we move forward. I mean, there's a lot of communities that wouldn't even allow RV storage on the individual single-family lot.
I just used that as an that if it could be somebody's just regular driver truck or car that they park on an unprepared surface.
Then they need to prepare the surface.
Okay, so this would apply to that situation?
I believe so, and we can discuss that in more detail, section by section. One of the things that we need to keep in mind, though, I think, when you're talking about residential areas is, I would presume we would not want the front yards to turn into a sea of parking. Want to keep some level of aesthetic that goes with it. There's actually a formula out there that was been derived on what is considered the maximum amount of paved area for a single-family residential property to keep some level of aesthetic value to the community, to the street frontage, as far as having landscaping and breaking up the...
Well, I'm more concerned about rainwater runoff, but...
Well, the lots are graded. I mean, I'm talking about the new properties primarily. I mean, the lots are graded to certain standards already.
Right. We just have to remember that a lot of this can be acceptable in an environment where you have an HOA.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Anthem, Florence Gardens, Caliente, they're all HOAs. They're used to working under these kind of rules. Bringing this into the historic district, there's no sense pissing off the natives. I can't think of any other way to say it. So we have to be careful just how much we impose. We have a lot of infill in the historic district, and so that means sooner or later we'll have new construction. And I don't want to find us in a position where people are walking away from new construction because they feel that the requirements are over the top. So let's keep that in mind.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you completely, and we already have certain mechanisms in place to prevent that through the redevelopment area and the core infill incentive district, and it should be addressed also, I think, and just throughout our code as we go through it. This is primarily related to, when you get into paving of parking and things of that nature in any detail, that it typically refers to multifamily and business, office, industrial, and new construction.
Right.
If something is having major additions or things of that nature in a non-conforming status, then they might have to come up to conformance, but it depends on the amount of addition or modification that happens. It generally does not apply directly to single family with minor exception. There also are products out there for, if we are allowing, for example, side yard storage of a vehicle or an RV, there are products out there that allow ground or rainwater to permeate through it. There's a lot of those used. We did them years ago, I know, up in Tempe when I was working there, where a shopping center actually, but you could do this residentially, wanted to put in extra parking, and they also wanted to help figure out a way to handle their water retention, their rainwater retention system. And so on the outskirts parking where the employees would park, there are paving systems that would be, it's kind of a checkerboard. So you'd have a paving system and grass plugs, and for general purposes, those work pretty well and allows groundwater to seep back through the paved area. Where we did run into problems, of course, were high heel shoes, things of that nature didn't work. But there are products out there that will allow rainwater to permeate through them to allow groundwater recharge. So. But we can certainly investigate those and keep those in mind as we move through this. We're not in a rush to make this one, go through. I want to make sure that we cover all the details that everybody is concerned about.
Good.
And I think my concern kind of echoes the chairman's concern that we have, just pick a name out of the sky, John Doe, has an older home that was built with a single driveway and to park a single car, and now he and his wife have two cars, and one of the cars is being parked in the dirt off the side of the concrete driveway. Would that be a non-conforming use? Would that be something that we would go and say, I'm sorry, if you're going to park the car in the dirt, you're going to need to put some sort of a surface down? Or would it be grandfathered in? Just kind of and then it can be the neighbor pointing at Mr. Doe because he doesn't like him and saying, well, he's got to fix that.
And that's a good question, and I'll probably need to sit down and talk with the attorney on that too. But because they're not expanding the use of the property, they just happen to have bought a second car. It's still a single-family home. There's no modifications to it, things of that nature. So typically, you would not require them additional paved parking area. At the same time, if there becomes some type of nuisance through dust or runoff, through monsoon season, if there's mud coming off because the surface has been modified or compromised because of constant, vehicle coming in and out of it, then we have a hazard issue that needs to be addressed. So
yeah, we better look at that then, because
we can do that.
Under that it says all parking and loading spaces shall be paved. That's the current wording, so it's just one of those words that means 100%. So.
Well, and some of these will be covered, maybe within the different sub-classifications of the zoning, but we'll definitely do what we can to address that up front. And paved prior to use too, which sometimes is an issue. I've run into situations where a new commercial building wants to open. They can get their C of O on their building, but they're not site ready yet. And you don't want to let them start parking on dirt because then it's hard to get them to stop. You can get bonds, assured letter of credit or some type of financial assurance, but then there's a waiting period time with that. So, we just as soon have it all, whatever's required to be paved up front on a new construction for commercial, industrial, office, those types of things.
Larry, just a hypothetical, but as an example, I went to True Value Hardware, and there were no parking spaces in front of True Value Hardware. Now, granted, it's summertime, not many people are here, but once the town grows, how are we going to accommodate people that want to go to True Value Hardware but may have to walk 2 or 3 blocks to get there? Does the town own any vacant land along Main Street that could be designated patron parking?
Well, right now, actually, there are several lots around downtown that the town owns that are paved for public parking. There's one just a block or so up the street on Main that fronts on Main. The other ones are typically, half a block back. Some of them or most of them have public restrooms on them too, which is really unusual and a very nice thing for the town to have done.
Yeah, some years
but that
ago.
is a bigger issue than the parking code itself.
Okay.
Get into that because traditional downtowns like like Florence's downtown has on-street parking. That's the way towns grew up. That's the way they evolved over the years. And as you can see, even in our downtown, things because of the raised sidewalks and things of that, you have certain curb issues and things like that is very common. It is not restricted to here. So there are parking nuances in the downtown, in a traditional downtown, that you don't have in new construction. The town has provided, I don't know what the count is, but I would say a significant number of parking spaces, though, in and around the downtown. Majority of it is about a half block off, so you don't necessarily see it from Main Street, but there's a lot of it here.
I have seen in other towns, but not here in Florence, and I don't even know if we're built for it, but we have the parking lot. Let's say that one parking lot behind True Value, fairly large parking lot. I've seen in other towns where they utilize, the public has been trained to use the parking lot, and the stores actually open their back doors so that they can get in from the parking lot. And if downtown got busy enough, perhaps the merchants would see that as an advantage. But we do have quite a bit of parking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've worked in a town.
ADA parking is an issue.
That's a separate issue, you're right. I've worked in a city exactly like that, and the public parking was to the rear of the lots. And ultimately what happened is there were so many people parking and then walking all the way around the block to come into the front of the store, and their businesses started recognizing that. They started dressing up the backs of their businesses and had a secondary entry.
That's right.
Even with restaurants, I've seen, eating patios and things out on the back nearer to the parking that they could access, so. It's definitely, and it happens just through the natural evolution of a downtown scenario.
Larry, what would be enforcement rules if someone were to park on Main Street a car and it's there for 3, 4, 5 days? Would it be the store owner's responsibility to report it to the police to have that car identified and perhaps moved?
It wouldn't be their responsibility. It would certainly be in their best interest. We do have a code regarding abandoned vehicles. I don't know what the details of it are. It's not within the development code. It's a separate code within the town code. But there are limits on when a vehicle is declared abandoned, how many days, not being moved. So yeah, it's already covered in the town code.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of give you an example of some of the things we're looking at. Joint use for multifamily, non-residential type mixed uses, PUDs, where businesses are going to share parking. Joint use typically means, let's say, where you have an office and some type of retail that are in adjacent properties or could be on the same property. And one of them, though, is a predominant 8 to 5 business, and the other one is more of an evening business, restaurant and offices, for example. I've seen it with churches and office complexes, because most of the church use is just going to be on the weekends or in the evenings, and the office use is going to be during the day, where they could share parking. So in certain areas, we'd be able to allow reductions in the overall parking, as long as there was a deed restriction tied to it, acceptable to the town attorney, that that confirmed that shared use and reduced parking, which means we're reducing the amount of paved surface area, which reduces the heat island effect and all the things that go with it. One of the things that this comes up everywhere. Shared parking can't be reserved for one business. I don't know how many times you've gone into a shopping center and you pull up to, the dry cleaner, and they've got these little rollout signs that they stuck in. It says reserved for so-and-so only. We want to get away from that. It's not something you want to encourage. It discourages people to use certain areas. If they pull in and those are the only empty places and they wanted to go to the subway next door, they're going to feel like, well, I can't park there. Well, yes, you can. There's no law that prevents you from parking there. So we want to take it, right up front and take care of those situations so they don't occur. That's our suggestion. Whether or not you all agree or if it makes it through to the final adoption, that's, a choice everybody has to make. But that's one of the issues that we see, or I've seen quite a bit over the years. Just as some things that we presently already have to a certain degree in the code, that any type of recreational vehicle storage would be behind a 6-foot wall that has gates and not more than 48 hours on the in the front on the street, for travel, for preparation for travel, or preparation to take to off-site storage, or when you come home from travel, a couple of days to clean it out and whatever. The town currently allows RVs to be stored on site. HOA rules, however, may be more restrictive. We do not enforce HOA rules, and should there be a conflict there, that is a civil matter between the property owner and the HOA.
This is going to take some rethinking.
I'm completely open to it.
Okay.
Like I said, many communities do not allow recreational vehicle storage on a residential lot, period.
I get it, but you can't put 6 layers on when you can barely tolerate 1.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's something to discuss. I mean, it's already in the code that they're allowed, so.
All right.
Calculations. Right now, your code prohibits somebody from over-parking their site. Let's say, I don't know, CVS wants to build something out here on Pinell Parkway, and they want to put in 60 parking places, but their footprint only requires 40. The way your code is written, they could not put in 60 parking places. They could put in 48, and that would be it. And I don't think that's fair. People know their business model. They know, what type of business to expect, what kind of volumes. They wouldn't be building the facility if they hadn't gone through the homework. So it doesn't mean we want to give a carte blanche necessarily. It needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and then through the design review process, come in front of this commission in order to have that approved as part of a site plan approval.
Well, a lot of that comes from rainwater runoff.
It's true.
How much paved surface are we going to allow, and where's that water going to go?
Correct.
So it's a little more complicated.
And I don't disagree. That's why we're going to assign a process to it so that it's just not something that happens over the counter.
Good.
Something we're kind of suggesting in larger commercial, office, multifamily, and possibly even in manufactured home developments, that the way the parking lots are connected, and you'll see this in a lot of communities, there's a sidewalk area that generally runs through the center of the parking lot, and maybe several locations through the parking lot, depending on the size of the center, that allows a walkway that's defined for pedestrians to traverse the aisles that run in front of the buildings. So again, a suggestion to consider. And then in other types of design standards as we talk forward, as we move forward with this review, that may come up that we feel is appropriate to be in the parking code. Other things too, not everything when you do parking lot allocations, calculations based on, not all of it's square footage. Depending on the type of use, we need to understand that sometimes you need to address it by shift work, by number of courts for a recreational facility, for tennis courts, things like that, by the seat, and whether, like in an auditorium or a theater, and is the seat attached? Because if they're not attached, that means that user can squeeze in more up to a certain point. By the number of students, vocational schools, high schools, whatever it might be, certain allocations for a number of students, you base it on student count. Or by employee, and again, this ties usually directly with the shift work, or medical facilities. You have so many per bed, plus you have so many for number of employees for the largest shift, plus so many for visitors, things of that nature. So we're going through parking calculations in the future. You'll see some of these types of terms popping up as we go through. Number of pump islands in a service station, convenience market. Yeah.
Larry, does the code address lighting on the parking lots?
There's a separate section under lighting. That's one of the ones that we're going to be tackling in the near future. We're going to look into the whole dark sky thing, but with the use, by the prisons, that's going to be difficult, but we're going to take a shot at it.
Okay.
And this is an example.
Pay attention to what we say anyway, so what the hell's the difference?
I'm sorry?
They never pay attention to what we say.
Well, that's true. But at least they can't say, the rest of the world can't say we didn't try. This is just an example of some of the things that we're looking at. Multifamily, addressing it by the number of bedrooms rather than square footage, guest spaces, RV storage if we choose to do that. Also looking at, for example, senior facilities or independent living facilities. They don't fall under a classic motel or hotel count or a classic apartment count because the number of vehicles is usually much lower. And so the demand isn't as great. And so we want to address those. Elementary school, K through 9 on there, again, number of staff and number of seats in the public assembly. Things like that. So we're going to be varying the requirements as we look at each different land use. And bring
Before you
forward.
leave that slide, you have one of the units there is a mobile home. And is that a mobile home that is truly considered a mobile home versus one of the modular buildings that you bring in on wheels, but you join two halves together and ground mount it?
It depends on whether a modular home has to follow UBC standards or IBC now. When they're built in the plant, they are brought to a site and then assembled accordingly. But these are stud wall, built like a traditional home. Mobile home or manufactured housing would have to have the state certification tag on them, and they have certain requirements as far as how old they're allowed to be and things of that nature. I think 3 years is the limit right now for one being placed on a site.
I've just seen some of the modern mobile homes that have 4 bedrooms and,
Right.
1,000 square feet, and probably one parking place for a place like that is probably not sufficient.
And you're probably very correct. Again, this is just an example of the way it will be presented. These are the details that we'll be going through basically page by page is the next step.
Mr. Harmon,
Yes, sir.
my ignorance, I need some help. What is a dwelling unit?
Usually it refers to a single family or a single family unit being housed in a single dwelling, but like in an apartment, you have 300 apartments, you have 300 dwelling units. Single family house is considered a dwelling unit.
Okay, so we're not trying to restrict the amount of, real estate code has restrictions on the amount of people that could live in
Right.
a building based on bedrooms.
Right.
We're not doing that. We're saying 2/dwelling unit for a single family. I don't know what that means.
Yeah. Based on this is just the parking standard itself. So it would be based on.
So 2 parking spaces per that dwelling unit,
Right.
2-car garage.
Because if you think, correct, a 2-car garage suffices as 2 parking places for a single-family home. Now, there are also the front yard setbacks, so therefore you have the driveway apron to park on also. So in essence, a single-family home ends up with 4 parking places. But the 2 that are required are the enclosed ones.
So if I go out into the desert and I build my mansion,
Oh, you can have a 6-car garage, that's fine.
okay, just making sure.
Oh, yeah. No, this isn't a restriction. This is the minimum standard.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, whenever we bring up numbers like this, it's the minimum standard.
gotcha.
We want to make sure we address ADA parking in its entirety. You address it pretty well in the code now. We just want to reiterate that it's not going away, and we'll be basing it on the most current federal law. Off-street loading, it's handled pretty well now, but we want to make sure that we're going to double-check the standards, double-check requirements against other communities, just to see what they're doing, if there's any need to reevaluate the way off-street loading systems are required in your code here, and that's typically going to warehousing, large commercial, things of that nature. And this is, let's see, is this one we have in our code right now? I'm trying to remember. I believe this is the one we have in our code currently, or similar to it. But this is, typical the way you see off-site loading. And then, of course, if somebody comes in with a warehousing type use, they're going to have their own needs and, multiple bays and all that. But that's part of the site plan and design review approval. Dimensions and circulation, we want to get a little bit more definitive. I'll just kind of gloss over this because a lot of this is already in the code in general terms. 6-foot wall separating commercial from residential, driveway location to be approved by the town engineer, driveways no less than 30 feet from the street. A lot of that's already in the code, but we want to make sure that you're aware that it's not going anywhere. But we also want to come up with some examples in drawing form. It makes it easier for the user, architect or engineer who's laying out a site plan to understand what we're talking about. And we can get into details on what is acceptable to the town and what isn't. This is from another community. That top one, for example, the herringbone or style of parking is not permitted there because of the number of accidents that happen in that type of parking. The car pulling in and hitting the one that's traversed in front of them happens a lot, and most communities have banned that particular layout. But also looking at angled and perpendicular parking as far as how the general layout is and where dimensions are taken, and we'll get into more detail as this moves forward on coming up with drawn examples and a dimensional chart that explains what the different requirements are for aisle width, space width, and depth, and things of that nature. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in electric vehicle right now. I know some cities and towns in Arizona, town of Wickenburg, I think they have 8 electric vehicle charging stations in their town hall parking lot. already installed for visitors and people using the facilities there. A lot of public entities are adding them across the state, across the country. But should we consider requiring those in commercial, office, multifamily, and also the types of signage, the appropriate signage, certain restrictions that tied to them, that they are limited to the electric vehicle charging only. In some cases, you're only allowed to park an electric vehicle in a charging station spot for 4 hours. And then you move it to allow another vehicle to come in and use the charging station. And that once your charging is complete, that you'd be required to move it. This is pretty much a standard condition we're finding, but again, something to be discussed as we move forward with the review. This is an example that we came across on how many are required. That a certain percentage of the required parking for a particular type of use would be in electric vehicle charging stations. We're looking for other examples just to see what the common denominator is on the percentage, and then we'll run a few hypothetical situations. You know, a commercial site that has 100 required parking, you know, are 3 electric vehicle charging going to be enough, 3%, or maybe want a higher number, or maybe there's a graduated scale, you know, depending on the size or depending on the number of required parking spaces, maybe the percentage goes up as, you know, as that number increases.
Where does the industry see the pure electric vehicles, not the hybrids, going? Are we anticipating the public start using more and more and more of
Yes.
them? Or are we plateaued now, or what do we have?
I don't think we're even remotely close to plateaued. I think that, well, within Maricella's lifetime, I would say 50% or more of the vehicles on the road are going to be electric vehicles.
So it sounds like that when we do this, that, you know, this is probably a good starting point, but we probably should do something there that does not impede us adding more as it's needed. We should not, you know,
Correct.
like Gary said earlier, not paint ourselves into a corner on.
Correct, I agree.
Larry, I'm not quite up to speed on electric cars, but is this a public service that we're going to provide to those individuals who have an electric car? When they pull up to the connection, is there a meter there, or?
Yes. There is a meter, and these days it's pretty much handled by a debit card or a credit card, and you charge your vehicle and it's a fee. It's not something that we're promoting as a free service. It would be a requirement for those businesses when they build a new, you know, new facility with parking, et cetera, that they put these in. But people with electric cars then have the ability when they go into the restaurant to eat. You know, they can park in that space, get it plugged in, have the charging happening while they're in visiting the restaurant,
Okay.
so that maybe they can get home afterwards. I still don't trust them. But they actually, I'm noticing, who is it? I think it's even Tesla that is working on electric tractor trailer rigs, and that they intend to have some on the road for testing, I think by 2020, I read. So they're coming. If that industry is going to them, I'd say it's here to stay, I would think. Also, just more detail on it. These are from other communities, the types of restrictions you would put on the electric spaces themselves, and there's actually already standards out for how they are designed, the sizes of them, where they're located, types of signage that goes with them. You know, just to make sure that all the bases are covered on it. Now, so far as I'm aware, statutorily, there's no ARS to tie to these, like there is for ADA spaces. But I have a feeling that we'll see that coming in the not-too-distant future also. Overall impacts, you know, just general things that we've already kind of addressed. We want to clarify terms. We want to clean up the overall codification system of the code as we go, and we'll start with parking so that we can add new code sections as technology changes or other types of land uses are brought forth, et cetera, to beef up our parking and loading requirements and adding the electric vehicle section. The next step, I wanted to introduce you to all this tonight so that we can move forward with it. This is not a state mandate like the small cell wireless that we'll talk about next. This is something that we feel is necessary, and I think that we've all agreed there are flaws in our code, so let's try to plug up the holes. The next step would be for me to distribute this internally to our legal counsel and some other departments to start getting feedback. We will, once we feel more comfortable with that first draft that you have a copy of, come back and then pull the tables together, sit down here, and really beat it up. We might even talk about, and it'll be up to all of you, that maybe starting at 5 o'clock some evening and go to 7 or 7:30 and work through it, rather.
Typically, from an agenda standpoint, if we're going to have that kind of work session, where we're going to roll up our sleeves, really take a look at development code, we will generally come in earlier.
Okay.
And get through that, and then we'll hold a regular planning and zoning meeting. If there happens to be anything on the agenda, like call it a public, nobody showed up,
Yeah.
goodbye. But I like the tables together. It's more conducive to discussion. The
I
echoes
agree.
in this room alone will kill you.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Oh, just, if I could, Larry, before we leave this topic, I just had a couple of things to ask you about. I know you're not the type to start from ground zero on this. Who or how many entities are we modeling this after?
It depends on which part of the subject matter, but basically we're just Google searching the heck out of it.
Okay, so
We'll put in like the electric vehicle. We just basically started with electric vehicle codes, or then electric vehicle ordinances, and just start doing searches. And I might look, or Mario might look at 20 of them and pick out 5 or 6 that looks like they have enough meat to them that we have something to work with.
and I'm talking about parking code in the bigger
Well, I'm just using that as an example, yes.
electric, because I know there's been a lot of tried and true codes that people have fought their way through and fought the battles with already, so I hope we aren't.
Well, I have to admit, to a certain degree, I'm pulling on some that I've drafted over the years too, and there's quite a few of those. But we look at communities our size or similar, let's say. We'll look at a Coolidge, we'll look at Casa Grande, we'll look at Maricopa. We'll also look at Gilbert, Chandler.
Good.
So we're giving a cross section.
Good.
We've actually also, I think, pulled up Sedona, Flagstaff, and Prescott. So we're getting samples from wherever.
It's great. Yeah, I like that tried and true stuff. The second thing is, many municipalities, to fight this term that you used earlier called the heat island effect, require landscape islands for so many parking spaces so we have tree structure and something to break up the landscape. I haven't had a chance to read this yet. Are we requiring something similar?
It's currently in our landscape code as much as anywhere, but I feel like you that we should be adding that to a great amount of detail. The typical one that I've come across is for every 20 spaces, there'll be at least one planter area that is 18 feet long by anywhere from 6 to 10 feet wide. We'll get pushback when it comes time to administer it from commercial developers, because in their mind it eats up their profit areas. But we need to look out for the community, and
That's becoming pretty much SOP across the valley.
absolutely.
So I'd heartily encourage that. The last thing is, parking lots are very conducive to the placement of front load dumpsters. And so I hope that we have something in here that addresses one of those front load garbage vehicles being able to have maneuverability and viewability for the driver, and also something to deal with the aesthetics of those and how they look to somebody driving through a parking lot, one of those dumpster locations.
Yeah, they need to be required to be enclosed with closing gates.
I didn't know if that was here or someplace else, but
someplace else in the code, but it's no problem adding it here for that matter. But there are engineering templates that can be laid, scaled templates for turning radiuses, all those types of things that will be addressed, yes.
I'm very familiar with those. I just hope it's somewhere here, if not here, someplace else. So.
Right.
Okay.
Larry, my cover page says the town of Florence. Did I understand you to say that, as an example, Anthem has with the homeowner association rules and regulations about parking, as an example. You only have 72 hours to have your motorhome while you're charging it, cleaning it, loading it, unloading it, whatever. It has to be coned. So is our code for the town of Florence, doesn't have to be responsive to the HOA, or has any input into what the HOA determines to be the rules and regulations for that community?
The HOA is an independent agency, and if HOA out there is 72 hours, maybe that's what we want to do town-wide. I'm not married to 48, we just threw that in as an example, but the HOA can be more restrictive, they can't be less restrictive. So if our code says 48 hours, that's the way it would be enforced, and they could be ticketed. So if the HOA out there is 72, I have no problem considering it 72. I've seen both. It's not like there's a standard for that. But what you have to be careful of long-term is our people that have their friends come in and stay for 2 weeks and they're running electrical cords across the sidewalk. I mean, you run into some health safety issues, tripping hazards and things like that. So that's definitely an item to discuss. But we do not enforce the HOAs of individual communities. The town cannot do that. That's a civil issue.
Okay.
Ready to move on?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts? Again, this was to be an introduction. Next time around will be to sit down and butt heads close table to table, and then we will have a community. We'll schedule at least one community meeting outside of Town Hall, probably over at the community center, and advertise it accordingly. It'll be on the town's website, Facebook page, probably a newspaper or two in the area, prior to it coming back for public hearing with the Planning Commission and ultimately the council.
Okay.
When we have our public meetings like that, do we target any of the groups? I'm thinking of like the Home Builders Association, or any of these special interest groups, this commercial development groups, so that we can fight that battle now versus fighting it in a council meeting?
Typically we do.
Good,
Yes.
awesome.
Bill?
Yeah, are we going to have a session with the council before we go too far? I mean, to where we're all together,
Such as a work session, or
like a work session, yeah.
we certainly can.
Or, well, you're talking about another work session where you're talking about just the commission and staff, or were you talking about?
Well, generally, I would like to do one with just commission and staff first, and then
Okay.
the council, would be a separate work session, or it could be a joint one. That's, I'm open either way there, but I think initially we want to have one with just commission and staff to start ironing out some of the questions and details that we would anticipate.
Well, it's like there's one thing here that the 6-foot masonry wall for RVs, and that's on residential. Why, I mean, a masonry wall, a 6-foot masonry wall, that's quite an outlay of money. When a lot of areas in town just have cyclone fences in between, and some of them have wooden fences in between. Is that going to be on new construction, or I mean, I'm just wondering, that's quite a burden, and if it's, my understanding on the old code, I think, was they had to be parked on the side of the house or in the back.
Correct.
Now, out front, they were not allowed, but all I'm saying, it's kind of overly restrictive, I think, to make them have a 6-foot masonry wall installed. That could be
Expensive.
And that's why we would have the work sessions, to start hashing out those types of questions.
right. Well,
What we've done is put in here what is typical in the various communities we've researched, and keeping in mind that some of the areas you're talking about I'm quite familiar with. And if those RV storage, you know, they're already there, that's grandfathered anyway. You can't go back and retroactively require them to put up walls and screening devices.
Okay, if it changes ownership, then, okay.
Runs with the land.
But even on new construction, I think limiting them to a masonry wall versus a cedar, 6-foot cedar fence, that's what I'm saying.
Oh,
You know,
that's-
if you're just trying to block the view, but, and then on the electrical, who pays for the infrastructure on the charging stations? Would it be Indian Service or APS or Salt River Project? I mean, or would it be the town itself, or would it be the owner of the development? I mean,
That would have to, yeah, again, the town is not saying that we are going to install those. The way these requirements are, it would be up to, for the developer to be working with their power provider to, you know, to put it in. It depends on the rules and requirements of that power provider. Some of them, I believe it was APS, was actually footing the bill for a lot of them because they knew they were going to get the money back because of the charging fees.
well, it's just, I know it'll be pretty expensive because it's going to have to be, I'm sure, be run underground and, yeah.
But they're running the power there anyway for their lights, for their buildings. So I don't know the full details of those, but no, we're not proposing that the town pay for these. This is up to the developer for new development.
Okay.
You good? Anything else from the commission?
That was the only major stuff.
All right, then I will move that we close from the work session and come back to our regular meeting agenda. Do I have a second?
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
I guess this is an announcement. July 5th, 2018 meeting is canceled.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we just want, normally I kind of hope or wait till the last minute because just to see if we have any items come up. But since that is the 4th of July week, Mr. Burkhart and I are both going to be out of town. I'm not ready to throw Ms. Benitez to the wolves yet. So we're just letting you know ahead of time we'll be canceling the meeting.
Well, you know, you can't get wet if you don't get in the pool.
I believe council is canceling theirs that week too. The 2nd, I believe council might be canceling the July 2nd meeting too.
I hope so.
I'm not sure.
All right, let's move on. We have a presentation by Development Services. This is the commission will hear an update on the progress of the proposed small wireless facility ordinances and terms and conditions. Mr. Burkhart, you are center stage.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pranzo, Commissioners. On June 7th, your last meeting, you dove in to small cell wireless text amendments, including the town code, adding a section to allow for small cell wireless facilities in the rights-of-way, as well as some modifications to address impacts of that state legislation and the town code for wireless facilities in our zoning code for wireless facility ordinance. And then as well, we have terms and conditions that you discussed. I think was a topic of much of the conversation. Since that time, we have updated the codes and track changes in response to questions raised and direction from the Planning and Zoning Commission. And you have that in your memo and packet tonight. Also, since June 7th, we were able to post that draft, this modified draft that you have before you, on our Development Services website, including a ability for viewers to submit online comments or email comments to staff on that specific topic. We've also posted on Facebook that link to that draft and the ability to make comment, and then we're also looking at scheduling a July 12th neighborhood meeting at the community center to continue to field comment from the public. That said, before we get into some of the details of the revisions and updates, since our last meeting. We're looking at July 19th, possibly, for a public hearing at the Planning and Zoning Commission, which then would be your ability to make additional changes and/or a recommendation, should the commission wish to make a recommendation to the town council that evening. That said, we're also then looking at August 6th and August 20th for town council discussion. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how we may progress from here, depending on your feedback and the public's interest in this topic. So that said, you have a copy of the track changes. I would be happy to entertain either way, if you'd like to just go right to some specific items that you might have or want to address, or if you'd like me to just walk you through the direction that we receive and how we address those. It's up to you, Chairman.
I just only have one addition I would like to add to it, and after that, I'm pretty much okay. I don't know about the other commissioners, so I won't speak for them. Under 150.183, it's design criteria.
Can't even see it.
I want to add a section called wind loading. And I will give you my notes or write it and explain it to you, but it goes like this. Anticipated wind loading shall not exceed 25% of the yield strength of the monopole base material. And that goes back to our last discussion when we talked about the absence of any calculations due to weight. This will put that in perspective. And after the meeting, if you want me to explain to you how yield strength works, I'll be glad to do it, so you're not caught flat-footed.
We'll make that update and review it.
Thank you. And I'll open it up to the commission.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've had the opportunity to just real quickly glance at and look at the notes that were taken at last meeting and the changes that were made here, and it looks like that the bulk of them have been changed, but I do have just a couple of questions just because I can't find them in this draft. Under the, it used to be noted as 201.05B under town code. There was a little bit of a discussion about there that I think Chairman Pranzo has talked about weight being used in the structural calculations and structural load calculations. And in the packet that I've got, I can't find that.
Okay. Chairman Pranzo, Vice Chair Frost, it would be, so the comment was we need to make sure that we're identifying that structural and wind load calculations are included with applications.
Weight and all that other stuff.
Exactly. So it's actually 120.05 under application.
I wonder if in the minutes we incorrectly noted that then. 'Cause in the minutes it says 201.05.
Oh, my apologies. It should be 120.
Yeah, so it's got some,
Fat fingers.
we better change the minutes then.
Very good.
Okay.
Make that update correction. And then do you see where that is addressed under 120.05C?
Yes, now I do.
We added engineering and structural design.
Now I know where to look.
Council member.
Yeah, I was wondering, once these are installed on the poles, let's say down the road, we decide we want to, for aesthetic reasons, we want to do away with poles and go underground. Who's liable for the cost of, or can we do that once they're on the pole? Can we take them away to where there isn't any poles there? Would that prevent us from doing that? I mean,
Thank you. Chairman Pranzo, Councilman, not at all. Anytime the city has a change or the town has a change and it's included within our terms and conditions, it's the operators or the provider, cell provider's responsibility to remove their equipment. And we have a notification requirement and we give them some time as authorized in the terms and conditions, to remove their equipment. Once we underground, then they need to make a reapplication to either add a pole or some sort of vertical structure if they need to be elevated again.
So in other words, we're there, from now on with this new law, we will always have poles sticking up. In other words, we can't.
No, if the town decides we're going to underground facilities and there happens to be a wireless facility that falls under the terms of this code, we notify them to get their stuff off our pole because we're removing the pole. And then they would have, and we're going underground, then they would have to then find a solution possibly to erect their own pole.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Then you're going to have another pole.
Right. It might be a light pole or a monopole or something of that nature. But if we do have, per the legislation, we do have the responsibility to permit applications within our right-of-way. And typically, they're always vertical at this point with this current technology. So they would go find something or say, we need coverage in this location, and we're going to build up to a 50-foot pole or up to a 40-foot pole with an antenna on top of it that could get up to 50 feet. And given it meets our building permitting processes and it's excluded from zoning, that's one of the statutory requirements. We can't do a use permit to see if the neighbors want to look at that. We would have to permit it by right. But yes, that is part of it.
Was it the Corporation Commission or was it the legislature that?
Legislature.
Well, there's, so in other words, the towns and cities have no way of keeping their visual aesthetics to their own standards anymore.
And if I could, one example, 2 years ago, the town received about 3 different applications from Verizon up in the Anthem area. So we do have light poles, street light poles. Many communities have requirements for street light poles to make sure we have illuminated roadways and intersections, but they did it at the time, and still today, the town's process is an administrative design review process to allow that to be placed, and that's what occurred. So there is antennas on light standards in Anthem today. So that would likely be the place, either traffic signals, or they would request to put in a light pole in our right-of-way within the confines, these dimensional restrictions that the statute does identify. But we would be obligated to permit that.
Okay.
That's
Well,
where-
you answered my question. I would just, yeah.
That's where it gets tricky because we actually go into the utility right away.
Public right-of-way, town property
Right.
only. That's all this
I know, but there's
legislation
a
affects.
right of way designated as a utility right of way.
It's usually just an easement.
Excuse me?
It's usually just a PUE, right? They're within our right-of-way in their easement.
Right, the right-of-way have their level of
It's their easement, yeah.
encumbrances, easements, public utilities, the allowance of private utilities. If we do franchise agreements for telco and cable and public, it is public property. It's our liability.
All right, you're just giving me food for thought because you could end up overpopulating these right-of-ways with poles. But I imagine this equipment is sophisticated enough that if they put one pole up, it would be quite a distance again before they needed to put another one up, I would hope.
Right, Chairman, Commissioners, as we discussed, it's really a density and demand issue. Florence is smaller
Go ahead, say it.
compared to other suburbs and then the city, obviously. So I think I've asked the providers, based on our last meeting, to give me a sense of what they anticipate or what their projections might include, and haven't heard back. But I did want to be able to present what could you see in the next, in the foreseeable future. I think what's occurred in the last 3 years is probably indicative of the pace of the capacity needs. 3 in Anthem, which is relatively a new community in the last decade. So downtown obviously isn't growing, doesn't have the housing permits that area has, or the demand, so I
I'm
think
still
that should
still
help.
trying to grab a mental picture of what this is going to look like. I mean, I could see a pole with a bunch of stuff on it. I got past that, but what's it going to look like out there?
In downtown.
What's the frequency going to look like? Is it going to be noticeable? Is it going to interfere with the aesthetics of the town? That sort of thing. We really need to get our arms around that.
I have graphics I can forward as well.
That would be great.
We looked at a few at the last meeting, but I can show you the applications, the photo simulations that we have on file, which is very indicative, I think, of what we could receive. And then I found a few others in historic areas.
As it would look in Florence.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
That, and I think it's basically the technology is what it is. So you have a light pole. Now they need to extend about 5 or 6 feet above that light pole with 3 different, it could be one of 3 different types of applications. One being a canister or a round cylinder, one being having the panels, the
Right.
3 panels, and then one just a long, elongated rectangle. And I'll send those to you so you can take a look. But that's from and then the strand mounted, like I mentioned, if you have the above, and we looked at, if you have the overhead lines, they're looking at a lineal attachment to overhead power lines. So I'll send those over to you just so you have an idea. And we'll,
I want you to
also
understand
address that
my
next
thinking.
time.
Most of our poles are wood. So the only place you can really mount these things without installing new poles would be in our streetlights. Even the streetlights are hanging on wooden poles, unless you get into the downtown where we have newer lights. So this is an interesting prospect.
Chairman, I'll prepare a photo simulation
Oh, I got it. I'll end it. Go ahead.
of one of your downtown light
I'm
poles.
beating this
And
horse.
keep in mind, in lieu of asking somebody to do something, or, the providers, but I think we can do a good
All right.
job at showing you what that could look like.
Do we have anything else from the commission?
Yes, please. Within the, gotta turn back, sorry. Within the terms and conditions section, under subsection 4.5, you've added language that says, thank you, the annual permit shall include disclosure of safety, training, and instruction for town employees subject to section 9 of this agreement. But in section 9, there is nothing there that requires safety training.
So in this approach, the theory was Section 9 establishes the requirements for safety training. We require an annual permit under Section 4.5.
Right.
Each application could be different depending on the provider or the technology they use. So we recognize, and over 5 years after the first deployment, it could be a different technology or switch or function. So we wanted the ability to be able to attach the safety shutoff and all those safety responsibilities with that annual permit, so that can be updated annually as technology changes or they make a modification to their pole. We felt that that would be the best way to have that addressed.
Well, and
So under Section 9,
And
right.
I totally agree with you, but it says there, it says disclosure of safety training. But in accordance with Section 9, but Section 9 does not require safety training. It requires a cutoff switch and a notification, a 24-hour notification.
Or
but
one of those 2 options.
no mention of any safety training. That's why I'm hung up a little bit.
And, okay, we'll clarify that.
Yeah, if you just clarify, that'd be great.
That we'll have a documented safety procedure within each annual permit.
Awesome.
Do it, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's all my comments. Thank you.
I have none.
Okay. Well, Mr. Burke. Is this working? Yes. Thank you very much, sir. Is that the end of your presentation?
That's it.
Okay,
Anything else? Thank you, Chairman.
Nice job, thank you.
thank you, sir. All right,
Thank you.
moving right along. Call it a public. We got a full house tonight. Call it a public for public comment on issues within the jurisdiction of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Individual commission members may respond to criticism made, may ask staff to review a matter raised, or may ask that a matter be put on the future agenda. However, members of the commission shall not discuss or take action on any matter during an open call to the public unless the matters are properly noticed for discussion and legal action. Do we have any call to the public? Close the call to the public. Call to the commission, current events only. Do we have anything? Isn't this fun? Close current events. Call to the commission. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we adjourn this meeting.
I second that motion.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Frost, second by, help me out, I always forget.
Mr. Chappelle.
Commissioner Schappel. All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.